To understand the Salem Witch Trials, we have to step into the world of New England in 1692, a world that was harsh, deeply uncertain, and dominated by a worldview that saw the devil lurking behind every misfortune. Salem Village, which is now modern-day Danvers, was not a place of peace and prosperity. It was a frontier community, fragile and vulnerable. Life was precarious. Families worked hard just to survive, and the ever-present fear of crop failures, illness, or attacks by native tribes shaped daily life with an intensity we can hardly imagine today. The Puritans who settled there carried with them a strict religious code that demanded conformity and obedience. To them, the wilderness surrounding their settlements was not only wild land, but a kind of spiritual battleground, a place where Satan and his forces were always plotting to infiltrate and corrupt. What often gets overlooked is the social and political instability that defined this time. Massachusetts, in the late 17th century, was not a unified, peaceful colony. Conflicts with indigenous peoples, particularly King Philip's War, a generation earlier, had traumatized communities. Many families in Salem had relatives who had been killed or displaced by violence. On top of this, the colony had lost its original charter, which had created deep anxiety about political legitimacy. For a people who believed their covenant with God was tied to order and obedience, the absence of political clarity was profoundly unsettling. These uncertainties created a pressure cooker where suspicion and fear could easily boil over into accusations of witchcraft. Adding to this was the ever-present specter of disease and death. Epidemics swept through New England towns with regularity. When livestock died mysteriously, or when children fell ill without explanation, the Puritan imagination immediately connected these misfortunes to the devil's influence. They did not see illness as a random event of biology, but as a cosmic sign of divine displeasure or satanic attack. In such a worldview, nothing happened by chance, and every disaster was charged with spiritual meaning. This is what gave the accusations of witchcraft their explosive power. Once the suspicion was raised that the devil was operating through human agents, the community could not easily dismiss it. The rigid authority of the Puritan Church magnified these fears. Ministers were not just spiritual leaders, they were the interpreters of cosmic reality. They taught that Satan's power was real and active, and that witches, those who had made a pact with him, were among the greatest dangers to the community. The Church created a constant surveillance of behavior, where gossip, disputes, and even eccentric personalities could be reframed as evidence of witchcraft. A woman who lived on the edge of town, who was quarrelsome with her neighbors, who had knowledge of herbal remedies or unusual dreams, she could easily be reimagined as a servant of the devil. The Church's authority ensured that suspicion was never just private. It was public and communal, feeding into trials that would eventually consume dozens of lives. Salem in 1692, then, was not a place where witch hysteria appeared out of nowhere. It was a crucible of fear, forged by frontier violence, political upheaval, disease, and the heavy hand of religious absolutism. The villagers lived inside a mental universe where spiritual warfare was the lens through which every misfortune was seen. This context is essential, because without it, the accusations would make little sense. They were not random acts of paranoia, but the natural outcome of a culture already trained to look for the devil's hand in every shadow. When most people hear about the Salem Witch Trials, the story is often presented in a very familiar way. A tale of mass hysteria that gripped a small Puritan community and spun wildly out of control. The narrative is usually reduced to the idea that fear and superstition blinded the townspeople, leading to false accusations, sham trials, and tragic executions. It's the version that gets repeated in classrooms, in documentaries, and even in tourist guides. Salem, in this common telling, is remembered less as a historical community and more as a cautionary fable about what happens when people let fear run unchecked. In this official narrative, the emphasis is placed on hysteria, as if it were a kind of contagious madness. Young girls, caught up in strange fits and trances, accuse their neighbors of consorting with the devil. Their stories, exaggerated by fear, were taken seriously by the adults, who then dragged the accused into court. Soon, it became impossible to stop, as more and more accusations spread. The town fell into collective paranoia, and before it was over, 20 people had been executed, and many others imprisoned. The story usually ends with the trials collapsing once people realized how absurd and unjust they had become, followed by a period of remorse and apology. It is a tidy version of events, easy to digest and to use as a lesson. We're told that the Salem Witch Trials show the dangers of superstition, the perils of letting religion and law intermingle too closely, and the importance of rational thinking. Teachers and historians often present it as an early American warning against mob mentality, one that resonates with modern audiences who see parallels in moments of panic or moral crusades in their own time. The moral seems clear. Reason must triumph over irrational fear, or else society descends into chaos. While this account is not entirely wrong, it is incomplete. By focusing so heavily on hysteria and superstition, the official narrative simplifies what happened and strips away the deeper layers of meaning that made Salem possible. It turns a complex moment of social, political, and spiritual tension into a neat morality play about ignorance. This framing may help modern people feel that we have moved past such errors, that we are more rational and enlightened now, but it avoids asking more difficult questions about power, about how communities construct scapegoats, and about the way ritual and fear operate at the collective level. Even more importantly, this version of the story treats the accused women and men as mere victims of mass confusion, rather than as figures caught in a battle over authority and meaning. The trials were not just random eruptions of fear, they were deliberate processes, carried out by leaders who believed they were protecting the soul of their community. To reduce the trials to hysteria alone is to ignore the structures of power that shaped them. Fear did not simply spread like an infection. It was cultivated, directed, and harnessed by those who stood to gain from it. The official narrative, in other words, leaves us with a surface-level understanding of Salem. It tells us the what, but it does not probe deeply into the why. It reassures us with the idea that superstition was the problem and rationality the cure, but it avoids grappling with the shadow side of human communities, the way fear can be ritualized, the way authority can transform imagination into a weapon, and the way accusations of witchcraft revealed underlying anxieties about gender, knowledge, and control. If we stop at hysteria, we miss the real story hidden beneath the surface. Beneath the surface of the Salem Witch Trials, there were currents of meaning that go far deeper than hysteria or even political conflict. From a Gnostic perspective, what unfolded in Salem can be seen as a clash between two forces. On one side, the rigid external authority that sought to dominate the soul of the community, and on the other, the suppressed streams of intuition, knowledge, and alternative ways of being that could not be controlled. These hidden undercurrents are often invisible in the official narrative, yet they reveal how the trials were not only about law and order, but about the repression of gnosis, inner knowing that threatened the structures of power. One of the most significant elements at play was the fear of the feminine. In Puritan society, women who stepped outside prescribed roles quickly became suspicious figures. The Puritan worldview demanded that women be silent, obedient, and anchored to the household. Yet the figures most often accused of witchcraft were women who disrupted that pattern. Widows who had no male guardian, healers who used herbs and remedies outside of approved medical channels, outspoken women who quarreled with their neighbors. These were the ones who drew the gaze of suspicion. They embodied a kind of independence that unsettled a patriarchal society. To the Gnostic eye, this is not coincidence. The feminine, which often symbolizes intuition, healing, and connection to the natural world, was being demonized and hunted. The accusation of witchcraft became a symbolic attack on the feminine principle itself, an attempt to crush any form of knowledge or power that lay outside the sanctioned religious order. The idea of gnosis, the direct, inner knowledge of truth, was also at stake. Folk practices, dreams, and healing traditions represented alternative streams of wisdom that bypassed the rigid hierarchy of the church. A woman who knew how to ease childbirth pains with herbs, or who claimed to sense the meaning of a dream, embodied a way of knowing that did not depend on the minister's sermon or the magistrate's ruling. In a society obsessed with control, this was dangerous. To accuse such a woman of witchcraft was to delegitimize her knowledge, to reframe her gnosis as diabolical rather than divine. What was suppressed in Salem was not only individuals, but whole traditions of alternative wisdom that threatened the monopoly of the church. There is also a ritualistic shadow running through the trials themselves. While we imagine witchcraft as secret gatherings in the woods, what actually played out in Salem were public spectacles that functioned like rituals of fear. The trials brought the community together to witness confessions, accusations, and executions. Each event reinforced the collective story. The devil is real. He is among us. And only by rooting out his servants can we survive. From a Gnostic standpoint, these were not simply judicial procedures. They were elaborate performances designed to channel fear into obedience. The accused became symbolic offerings, sacrificed to maintain the illusion of purity and unity in the community. The hidden undercurrents of Salem, then, reveal that what was truly being fought over was not witches, but knowledge, freedom, and the right to define reality. The Puritan authorities could not tolerate voices that challenged their monopoly on truth, so they constructed a drama in which fear of the devil justified the silencing of those voices. What emerged was not the exposure of real dark rituals, but the creation of a darker ritual altogether, a communal drama of accusation and punishment that bound the people to their leaders through fear. Salem becomes, in this light, less a story about superstition gone wrong, and more a story about the suppression of gnosis through ritualized violence. At its core, the Salem Witch Trials were about power. Fear may have provided the spark, but power determined where the fire spread, who was consumed, and who emerged untouched. The Puritan authorities, both ministers and magistrates, understood how to harness the atmosphere of terror for their own ends. They did not merely react to the accusations of young girls, they shaped the process, formalized it, and used it as a means of consolidating control. From a Gnostic lens, this is the work of the archons, the powers and rulers who operate through fear, illusion, and external authority to bind human beings to their control. The ministers were the intellectual architects of the trials. They were the ones who taught that the devil's agents were active in the world, and that identifying them was both a spiritual and civic duty. Their sermons created the framework in which accusations could be understood as evidence of cosmic warfare. The courts then translated these beliefs into legal action, giving the process the appearance of order and justice. But beneath the surface, what was really happening was a ritualized display of authority. The ministers and magistrates placed themselves in the role of interpreters, the only ones who could decide what was real and what was deception. They became the gatekeepers of truth, and by doing so, tightened their grip on the community. The methods they used reveal how power operates through manipulation of the imagination. Spectral evidence, for example, allowed accusers to testify that they had seen the spirit of an accused person tormenting them. This meant that someone could be convicted not for actions in the material world, but for supposed appearances in visions and dreams. Such evidence was impossible to disprove, and it shifted the very ground of reality. The community was being trained to accept that the unseen was more real than the seen, but only when interpreted by the authorities. This was a profound act of control. Reality itself was being rewritten to favor the power of those in charge. The use of confession also played a key role. Those who confessed to witchcraft and named others were often spared execution, while those who maintained their innocence faced the gallows. This created a powerful incentive to submit, to internalize the authorities' narrative, and to spread it further. It was a self-perpetuating mechanism. The more people confessed, the more the story of Satan's infiltration seemed to be confirmed, and the more power flowed into the hands of the magistrates and ministers. From a Gnostic perspective, this is the perfect example of how archontic systems trap the soul. They force individuals into a cycle of submission and betrayal, binding them ever deeper into a structure of fear. What emerges is the realization that the Salem Witch Trials were less about rooting out evil and more about maintaining order through terror. The authorities exploited the community's anxieties about disease, war, gender roles, and disobedience, and directed them toward vulnerable individuals. By turning neighbors into enemies, by transforming suspicion into evidence, they fractured the bonds of community and redirected loyalty upward, toward the church and the courts. The more fractured Salem became, the more dependent it grew on the very authorities who had created the fear. This is the dark genius of power in Salem. It used fear not only to destroy lives, but to bind the living more tightly to external control. The accused were sacrificed, not to the devil, but to the archons of authority who demanded obedience. The trials revealed, in stark form, how myths can be weaponized to dominate the psyche. Salem is not simply a story about hysteria. It is a textbook example of how systems of power thrive by ritualizing fear and turning human imagination into chains. When people think of witch trials, they often imagine shadowy gatherings in the woods, women chanting incantations around a fire, or strange ceremonies calling upon dark powers. That imagery has been repeated so many times in popular culture that it almost feels inseparable from the Salem story. Yet the historical reality tells us something different, something even more unsettling. There is little evidence that any of the accused in Salem engaged in occult practices or what we would call dark rituals. The so-called witches were, for the most part, ordinary people caught in the crosshairs of fear and suspicion. The idea of actual diabolical ceremonies was largely projection, a mirror of Puritan anxieties. What the ministers described in sermons and what the accusers imagined in their visions were not revelations of secret gatherings, but reflections of their own fears and repressions. The irony is that while accusations revolved around imagined rituals, the trials themselves became the true rituals of Salem. Each courtroom drama functioned like a public rite, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to channel fear into submission. Testimonies of spectral visitations were spoken aloud before the entire community, with girls writhing, crying out, and claiming torment by invisible forces. Judges questioned the accused in ways that assumed guilt from the start, pressing them to confess or name accomplices. Each of these acts, repeated again and again, became liturgical in its rhythm, a kind of dark mass that reenacted the same story. The devil is here, his servants are among us, and we must root them out. Even the executions carried ritual weight. The hangings on Gallows Hill were not just punishments, they were symbolic sacrifices. Each condemned person was offered up before the watching community as a sign that the battle against Satan was being fought with vigor. The fact that so many of the accused maintained their innocence to the end only intensified the ritual, because their deaths embodied the triumph of authority over resistance. From a Gnostic perspective, these killings were not the destruction of witches, but the sacrifice of truth-seekers, dissenters, and vulnerable souls to a system that demanded blood to preserve its illusion of purity. The real dark ritual in Salem was the collective act of fear binding itself to authority through death. It is crucial to recognize how projection operates here. The Puritans feared that witches were gathering in secret, performing obscene rites, and offering allegiance to the devil. But what they themselves enacted was no less ritualistic. The sermons that prepared the ground, the courtroom spectacles that staged the drama, the confessions wrung from the accused, the executions carried out in public, all of these followed a structure that satisfied the community's hunger for order. They gave shape to anxiety, channeling the chaos of war, disease, and social division into a controlled performance. In this sense, the true coven was not a group of women in the woods, but the leaders of Salem orchestrating public displays of fear. Seen in this light, the witch trials invert the story they claimed to tell. The authorities said they were fighting against dark rituals, but they were, in fact, performing them. They spoke of rooting out the devil's servants, but the system they built fed on human lives in a way that mirrors the very evil they feared. The Puritans wanted to believe they were defending themselves from Satan, yet the structures they created functioned as instruments of destruction, fueled by lies and sustained by blood. The real darkness of Salem was not hidden in the accused, but displayed in plain sight. It was the ritual of fear itself, repeated until it consumed the community. The Salem witch trials did not simply end when the executions stopped. Their shadow lingered over New England for generations, and the lessons they carry reach even further, into the present. On the surface, the legacy was one of shame and remorse. Within a few years, the courts admitted they had made grave mistakes. Judges, ministers, and townspeople confessed guilt for their part in the tragedy. Some of the families of the accused were even offered compensation decades later. Yet these apologies, while important, could not erase the fact that an entire community had turned against its own members, sacrificing them to fear. Salem became a wound in the cultural memory of America, a reminder of what happens when collective anxiety overwhelms compassion and reason. But beneath the official apologies lies a deeper lesson, one that resonates with Gnostic themes. Salem shows us how fragile truth becomes when external authority is allowed to dominate inner knowledge. The villagers were taught to distrust their own senses, to believe visions and accusations that defied reason, and to submit their judgment to the dictates of the church and the courts. The people were trained to exchange gnosis, direct, personal awareness of reality, for the scripted narrative handed down by authority. This suppression of inner knowing is the real danger that Salem reveals. When individuals surrender their own discernment, when they allow fear to silence the voice within, they become vulnerable to manipulation by those who rule. The trials also teach us about the destructive power of scapegoating. A community in crisis, racked by war, disease, political instability, channeled all of its anxiety onto the bodies of a few individuals. Those accused of witchcraft became vessels for the community's fears, symbols of everything threatening its survival. In killing them, Salem believed it was purging itself of evil, when in reality it was only enacting a cycle of violence that left the deeper issues untouched. This pattern is not unique to the 17th century. The same mechanism of scapegoating operates in modern societies whenever groups are demonized, whether for their beliefs, their culture, their politics, or their refusal to conform. Salem becomes a mirror, showing us how communities can devour their own members in a desperate attempt to control chaos. From a Gnostic standpoint, Salem reveals the face of the archons in action. These forces of control operate by manufacturing fear, by turning people against one another, and by disguising domination as righteousness. What happened in Salem is not confined to a Puritan village. It is a pattern repeated whenever fear becomes ritualized and authority demands submission. The trials remind us that the archons thrive when people forget their inner spark, the divine light of gnosis that allows them to see through lies. The true resistance to such powers does not lie in violence or counter-accusation, but in awakening the capacity to perceive reality directly, to trust the voice within, and to refuse the illusions spun by those who seek control. In our own time, we can see echoes of Salem in many forms: political witch hunts, media-driven panics, online mobs that destroy reputations. Each follows the same logic. Fear is ignited, narratives are weaponized, scapegoats are chosen, and authority grows stronger in the chaos. The technology may have changed, but the underlying psychology remains the same. Salem warns us that unless we cultivate awareness, we are always at risk of repeating the cycle. The lesson is not just historical. It is urgent and present. The true legacy of Salem, then, is not only its horror, but its warning. It teaches us that the most dangerous rituals are not those imagined in the woods, but those performed openly in the name of order, purity, or truth. It shows us how fear can masquerade as righteousness, how authority can twist imagination into chains, and how communities can destroy themselves from within. And it points toward the path of liberation, the recovery of gnosis, the refusal to submit to fear, and the courage to see beyond the illusions of power.